this country, and it's not dead.
Steve Morton is a CSIRO scientist based in Alice Springs. He spends much of his time investigating the interaction between animals and plants in the desert.
Like most other people, when I first came here, I thought this place was universally harsh and tough. That the dryness made it really difficult for animals and plants to survive here. But after 15 years or so of looking at these places, I've come to realize that there are two deserts. There's the crude harshness of the mythical one, and then there's the complex subtlety of the real desert that is the living heart of Australia.
The desert that Steve Morton has come to know is made up of a whole variety of landscapes. Some are harsh and dry, like the Gibber Plains, where the stones look as though they've melted under the searing sun. The creeping sand dunes appear inhospitable and devoid of life. They fit comfortably into the myth of the dead heart. But Steve Morton's desert is far more varied and complex. It includes the McDonnell Ranges near Alice Springs. They're so green, it's hard to believe that they're in a desert. Here, the irregular rains run off the mountains and seep into a band of rich country that supports trees, bushes, and nutritious grasses. And each of these areas supports its own special community of animals. Woodlands and grasslands like this are scattered all the way across Central Australia. These green stretches are by far the most fertile, traditionally supporting a large number of animals.
It'd be fair to say that 100 years ago, this place would have been bouncing with mammals. Dunnets, hopping mice, quolls, bettongs, the bilby, nail-tail wallabies, as well as the big red kangaroos. But today, when you look at these woodlands, all you find are the mouse-sized dunnets and the big reds. The medium-sized species seem to have gone. There's no trace of them. There's an eerie emptiness here. Something strangely wrong. A disturbance, as if another force has taken over. You don't have to look very far for the first signs of this force. For 100 years, cattle have been grazing in the richest areas of the centre. Apart from eating out the most nutritious plants, they've also eaten the tall grasses that supplied shelter for some of the native animals. It's taken us quite a while to work out the full extent of the damage. At their very worst, the cattle removed the plants completely, leaving the soil to be washed away by the occasional heavy rains or blown away during drought. The competition for food always reached its climax during the droughts. And it was during the droughts that the populations of native mammals collapsed. Today, the nail-tailed wallaby is completely extinct. The quoll has retreated into Western Australia, and the bilby lives on in tiny pockets in Central Australia, where it teeters on the brink of extinction. This place is a paradise disturbed.
The only remaining images of this paradise are the 19th century paintings of John Gould. They're a reminder of what's been lost, nearly 50% of the mammals of Central Australia. It's a part of our heritage that's slipped through our fingers.
While many of the medium-sized animals had their homes eaten from over them by the cattle, the larger red kangaroos were less affected. They aren't dependent on the tall grasses for shelter, and they eat a greater variety of plants, so they've been able to coexist with the foreign herds. Some animals survive because they live out of harm's way, on the rocky mountain slopes far from the reach of the cattle. The rock wallaby is always fed on the hidden pockets of green among the boulders. While the numbers of rock wallabies have remained fairly steady over the years, the bilby, or rabbit-eared bandicoot, wasn't so lucky. A 100 years ago, you would have been able to find millions of them across 2/3 of Australia. Today, there are only a few thousand left, and they're on the endangered species list. They preferred living in the woodlands and grasslands that the cattle have taken over. And so it's as if they've been excluded from their own country. At the moment, they are just hanging on in tiny rich pockets scattered throughout the harsher, drier plains.
You can never guess when it's going to rain out here, but when it does, it's dramatic. And the animals make the most of it.
The really important thing about the rain is that it doesn't just stay where it falls. And the animals and plants benefit from it long after the storms have passed. The water quickly finds its way into rivers that may run for hundreds of kilometres out across the plains. Within days, much of the water has disappeared, and all you can see are huge dried-out riverbeds snaking across the land. But the trees and plants along each riverbank show that the water is still there, held in the sandy bed. The rivers don't just peter out or disappear. They continue under the ground, and this water slowly but surely reaches the rich green pockets further out, beyond the cattle's reach. Now, this hole I've dug here is at least 50 kilometres away from the nearest mountain ranges and dry riverbeds, out on what appears to be an ordinary spinifex sandplain. And yet, beneath the surface layers of sand, I find traces of moisture, and the soil is rich and dark and silty. So what this means to me is that I'm standing on a vast buried river system, covered over by sand which has been swept back in over the past 10,000 years. So even now, the moisture is moving beneath my feet, gradually outwards into the plains, in a band 20 kilometres across and 100 kilometres long. And when that moisture is combined with deep, rich soil, then the plant life is varied and dependable.
These sand plain plants are flowering because of water stored in the ground. It hasn't rained here for at least 6 months.
This is never fail grass. It retains its greenness even during the hottest times. This is elegant wattle with fresh, succulent leaves. And over here, a bush with juicy, succulent berries. Now, all these plants and many more which grow in these drainage systems provide excellent food for plant-eating mammals. They can live here. They should be here. But when we look for them, we can't find them. There are no scratchings, no tracks, no dung, nothing. And in this case, we can't blame the cattle. We know that plant-eating mammals used to live along these buried river systems. The early explorers and travellers often saw and captured such animals. Bettongs, marla, other hare wallabies, a variety of the bilby, other bandicoots. And often they took skins of these animals back to the museums in the big cities. And more recently, colleagues of mine have brought these skins back out to the country to show to Aboriginal people. And very often, older Aboriginal people remember these animals from their youth, but they always say the animals have disappeared. It's a sad fact that these animals are now extinct or near extinct from this country. And the really interesting thing is that when these Aboriginal people are asked what they think is the reason for the disappearance of the animals, they almost always say it's because the country hasn't been looked after properly.
The Aborigines knew how to look after this country. As they hunted and moved across it, they burnt small patches for 2 good reasons. First, the burning drew in animals that feed on barbecued insects left in the wake of the fire. And this bird, the bustard, was prized by Aboriginal hunters. The Aborigines also knew that the burning would cause a flush of fresh green shoots, which over time would attract even more game back to the area. When the Aboriginal burning stopped 50 years ago, the supply of green shoots dried up, leaving just tough spinifex and shrubs. For a long time, Steve Morton believed that this is why so many animals have disappeared from the plains. But he now sees there's more to it.
Everyone knows about rabbit plagues in the southern states of Australia. But few people realise what the rabbits have done up here. For instance, a small wallaby called the bettong once lived in many parts of Australia. Today, it is extinct from the mainland. This is where bettongs used to live. You can see the mounds of rubble kicked up during generations of burrow building. Now, what I think happened here is that earlier this century, the rabbits poured through these fertile strips in huge numbers, literally eating the bettong out of house and home. And when you realise the extent of the damage caused by the rabbits, it's enough to make you weep. Ah, I've got it. Come on, you little so-and-so. Come out. Here's one of the culprits. But why is it that mammals like this one have been able to survive so much better out here when the native ones have gone? Well, in Europe, this rabbit would be hunted by at least 20 predators and suffer a whole range of parasites and diseases. But out here, this rabbit might have 5 predators and just a couple of diseases. So rabbits like this one have been able to use up all the plant resources that originally were eaten by the native mammals. You know, when I stop to think about it, it's as though rabbits have taken over our imaginations as well as our land. Bunny rabbits, teddy bears, pandas, animals from other countries are familiar to us, but we can barely recognise many Australian ones. Their very existence, let alone their fate, is one of the best kept secrets in the land. Take the marla, the hair wallaby. Only 50 of them have survived the impact of rabbits and the end of the patchy burning. They are staring extinction in the face in a tiny pocket of spinifex in the Western Desert. At first sight, they look much like several other small Australian wallabies, but they are quite different. They are a desert animal, and virtually all their habits are still a mystery to scientists. For instance, there's the marla's courtship, which starts off with a chase. What remains unexplained is the next phase, the male's urine spraying. The male sprays several times, but we still don't know what he's doing, whether he's marking territory or trying to stimulate his mate.
The last few marla have retreated to the spinifex sand plains of Central Australia. Cattle find it impossible to graze here, and there are very few rabbits. The only change is the way the country's been burned. In many ways, it is harsh, and only a few animals have ever lived in the spinifex. But the place is far from dead.
Here I am on a spinifex sand plain, far away from mountain ranges or any form of river system. The sands are poor, and the only moisture which is available to plants is that which falls as rain. This plant, spinifex, is the great survivor out here. Its roots penetrate meters deep into the sand and suck up the tiny amounts of moisture and fertility. So it thrives here, where other plants would die. And it's so successful that it covers a quarter of Australia. Now, we know it's too tough for plant-eating mammals here. And yet, spinifex forms the basis of an entirely different food web. It's a unique Australian wilderness that we're just beginning to understand. Just look at this. Dried spinifex, which the termites have brought in and cut up into chaff. There's an amazing amount of spinifex in here, perhaps as much as 100 kilograms. So the termites love it, even if other animals don't. And there are so many termites in here that if you collected them all together, they'd weigh as much as a cow. So what we see here is the equivalent of a whole mob of stationary cows just calmly chomping away on spinifex. And all these termites, together with the ants, and the scorpions and the grasshoppers, and all the other insects that live here, provide a rich source of food for an extraordinary array of lizards. In any one patch of spinifex, we found more lizards living together than in any other place in the world. The striped skink is a voracious hunter of termites. The thorny devil is one of the most unusual lizards, eating nothing but ants. And the goannas, the top predators, hunting other lizards as well as scorpions. This truly is the land of the lizards. And the really encouraging thing is that as far as we know, not one of them is extinct. They're all still here. Until about 20 years ago, these vast stretches of spinifex plain were considered pretty useless by white Australians. But from now on, more and more people are going to be coming here as tourists, hungry for space and the chance to rejuvenate their souls. These rocks behind me look as if they're set within a totally undisturbed wilderness. But let's have a closer look. You might think that I'm overreacting to the little bit of damage that a few tourist buses and a couple of four-wheel drives have done. But this is how it starts. There are ways of managing such areas so that they won't be spoilt for future generations. I don't think that tourism is a bad thing. I do think it's important that people should come here to see and experience this country for themselves. Just look at that landscape. A unique Australian wilderness. A complex web of land and plants and animals like nowhere else on Earth. How should we look at such a place? Well, in the past, many people persisted in seeing it as lonely and dead and inhospitable, a place to be feared rather than understood. And yet I feel comfortable and at home out here. The only discomfort that I feel is that these places have already been disturbed by acts of blind ignorance. Just think for a moment about that man, Thomas Austin, who first released rabbits in Victoria 120 years ago. Did he have any idea that they would eat their way clear through to the centre? Well, no, of course he didn't. He was simply trying to make the place a bit more like England. And the pastoralists, forever battling a climate which refused to behave like that of Europe. And as their herds perished around them, the health of the land and the survival of Australian animals were the least of their worries. But today, we've run out of excuses. We can't pretend any longer to be ignorant about our country or about the consequences of our actions here. The early warning signs are clearly visible. It's just a matter of seeing Australia's heart for what it really is.
Next week, we explore the myths and misunderstandings surrounding our most well-known marsupial.